You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the BioHealth Capital Region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk. And we have a social media personality on the podcast today. And he is so fortunate. We're actually airing this podcast during the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl parade. And it shows you what a priority my guest is today versus me watching my Chiefs in their Super Bowl parade today. But we have Jacob Greenwood, but it's actually Jake, who's the Director of Business Development for CRB and located in the BioHealth Capital Region. And Jake, welcome to BioTalk.
Thank you, Rich, and definitely a pleasure. And that was quite an introduction. And I'll go ahead and say congratulations on the Super Bowl win. We have a Philadelphia office and a Kansas City office at CRB, and somebody's sending somebody else some cheesesteaks.
So you're just like Mrs. Kelsey, who couldn't lose because she had a son on both teams, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, so all of the listeners will get an idea of actually when this is actually being recorded, but it'll actually air next week. But Jake, welcome. And a lot of people don't know your company and a little bit about your background. And when I say social media personality, Jake actually does a social media Wanna Go Wednesday, which we're going to ask him about later, which you'll see on LinkedIn every Wednesday, sort of talking about what's going on in the region. But before we get into that, let's let Jake do a little introduction on his background and how he evolved into CRB and in the BioHealth Capital Region. So take it away, Jake.
Yeah, thank you. It is wild to be introduced as a social media personality. Never thought that would happen in my life. I appreciate it.
We're both there now.
Yeah. So yeah, just a little bit about me in general. So I'm Baltimore native, born and raised in the city. Grew up there, went to Calvert Hall High School, because when you're from Baltimore and you say, what school did you go to? It always starts with high school. So,
you know what's funny about that? I have to interrupt you because when I first came to Maryland about 11 years ago, everybody said, where'd you go to school? And they didn't care where any college was. Basically, they wanted to know if you went to prep school in Baltimore somewhere. So anyway, you've been through that and you're so right on with that.
I have, yep. And that's just how it goes around here. But yeah, so I had a wonderful experience growing up here. And, obviously like most people that grew up in Baltimore, I never left. Went to college at Goucher College, where I studied biology. And I originally was going to go the med school track. And turns out this is a very relevant story. A ton of people have the same experience. Going to go to med school, and then they realize, I just don't want to be in school for another 8 years. So I had that realization and instead stayed here, got married. My wife and I are getting ready to celebrate our 16th anniversary this year. And we have two wonderful daughters, Caroline and Eliza, who are in 7th grade. So that's just a little bit of personal background on me. So after I finished up at Goucher, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. So fortunately, my dad's a home inspector, and he inspected a house for a guy that was recruiting for a company down at NIH. And so the company was Sobran Bioscience, and they were essentially a company that staffed all the animal research facilities down at NIH. So they had about 800 employees down there working in those vivariums. So I started out my career working in dirty side cage wash, basically getting all the mouse and rat cages and cleaning them out and sending them back. And yeah, it was, I can see your face, Rich. It's about how it sounds. Yeah.
That's like mucking the stalls, right?
That's right. Yeah. It is not the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills and it gave me some really great experience down there. So I really stayed with that company for 13 years. And it started out working down there, like I said, and I kind of moved my way up through technical duties and through management, and eventually found myself running 2 preclinical CROs. So they kind of moved from government contracting and opened up a commercial arm. So I was running a preclinical CRO facility up in Baltimore and then one down in North Carolina. So I did that up until the last 2 years with Sobran. And for those last 2 years, I moved into business development for that company. It was really kind of a natural fit. I found that when I was managing facilities, really my favorite part of the job was always spending time with the clients, making sure that their needs were met, just get a better understanding of what they were trying to accomplish. And found myself in a position where somebody said, hey, there's a whole job that does just that. So I found myself in business development. And then through just networking and events in the BioHealth Capital Region, came to know Ben Skoronsky, who was working for CRB. And he was moving into a new position with the company, getting ready to lead our Maryland office. And he asked if I was interested in coming to backfill his position as the director of business development. So that is how I ended up where I am today.
Well, great. I guess you're skipping med school is something of one of our gains for what you're doing in the region right now. And it's a funny story. My son wanted to be a doctor as well. And when he got to organic chemistry, he basically said, I don't think I want to be a doctor. I think I want to go into business. So it was easy to switch.
That to you.
It will do it to you. Yeah. Since you have that kind of a background, you'll understand it. So, and then you mentioned CRB, and people in your industry know CRB because it's a household name, but there's a lot of people that are listening to this podcast who have no idea what CRB is and what it does. So let's give the listeners an introduction to CRB.
Absolutely. So CRB stands for Clark, Richardson, and Biscup. So does that pretty much sum up what we do?
It basically said that there were 3 people that got involved in maybe founding CRB, but I don't, doesn't say what you do yet.
Pretty good guess. Yeah. So CRB is actually an architecture, engineering, and construction firm. We really focus solely on the life sciences and more recently the food and beverage industries. But we have, I think, a little over 1,700 employees now, spread over 22 offices, mainly in the US, but a couple of European offices and then one up in Canada. But really, our focus is on designing and building life sciences institutions. And that spans from the research and development side up to the manufacturing side and kind of anything in between. And so for the food and beverage half, that's not quite as prevalent in this area, although we do have some great food and beverage facilities. CRB as a firm doesn't do a whole lot of that here, but it is a growing side of the industry. And one of the interesting things that's happened in the last decade or so, we've seen alternative proteins as kind of an up and coming food source for people. And that's really been a combination of the two things we've done. So you get the standard food and beverage manufacturing and then all these bioreactor jobs that we do, and all proteins is kind of put them together. So it's been just kind of a nice side note as far as CRB's history. But overall, you'll find us in all the big life science hubs. So Boston, San Francisco, RTP, obviously here in the BioHealth Capital Region. The company's been around for about 39 years now. And Jeff Biscup, who is the B of CRB, he's still involved with the company. He still serves as our president. And he was just here a couple weeks ago for the ISPE Facilities of the Future show. So I got to get him out with some of the local leadership from companies in the area.
That's where we saw each other at the Marriott, right?
That's right.
Said, hey, why don't we do a BioTalk? It was at the IPSE meeting. Yeah, right. How about that?
Right.
Yeah. So when you talk about different institutions you work with, talk a little bit about, do you work for industry? Do you work with academic institutions? Do you work with government institutions? Or do you have some kind of a specialty area?
Yeah, so we do work across the board. I would say less so with the government institutions, just because you really, in order to work as a prime contractor for the government, you have to kind of be set up a certain way. So we don't do quite as much of that, which is much to my chagrin, because since we are down the street from the National Institutes of Health, I would certainly like to do more of that. So that may be a direction the company heads in the future. But we have done quite a lot of work with academic institutions. But the majority of our work is certainly with more commercial institutions. Think companies like AstraZeneca and GSK and Emergent.
And is your specialty in working around sort of the clinical areas in the building, or do you get involved in the whole engineering and architecture from ground up for the full building?
So that's a good question, because it touches on a couple of different areas. So there's what we consider kind of the core and shell from an architecture and construction standpoint. That's really what it sounds like, putting up the core and shell kind of from a greenfield standpoint. So a pile of dirt up to an actual building. And that is something we certainly get involved with, especially if you're looking at doing something like manufacturing. It's really important to do that core and shell properly from a design and construction standpoint so that it can support the infrastructure needed to do manufacturing. I would say much more often what we're involved in is more the brownfield, which is taking an existing facility and converting it into a research or manufacturing facility. But kind of the other thing that came to mind when you asked that was, what aspects are we truly designing and building? And 30 years ago, you would have said we were really designing a lot more of the shiny pipe manufacturing. So that's a stainless steel. But what we're seeing today is a trend of really needing to pull in all of the office space, the lab space, the manufacturing, all into one project. And so we do have an interior design group within our Maryland office. We've got our full architecture team, full engineering team, and a full construction team, all just within Rockville. And that's the case for many of our offices across the country.
Yeah, so basically you talk about conversions. I have a couple questions related to what you see here in the BioHealth Capital Region and the health of our industry, as well as the potential growth of the industry. So you get to see it from a different perspective because you're working probably with a lot of the developers who are developing the spaces. And what have you seen over the last couple years based on the types of transactions and activities you've been involved in? And what do you see as the future projection for what's going on within our BioHealth Capital Region?
So normally when you would talk about the last couple of years, it would mean something very different, right? So in this industry, certainly the last couple of years have been a bit of an anomaly. So we did see an incredible amount of activity during the pandemic. Everything was shut down. So even before that, this was a very growing region. So we put our Maryland office in place in 2015. Like most of the people that do what we do, we were serving this area out of either our Philly office or our North Carolina office. But in 2015, we realized it just wasn't going to work long term because there was too much activity in Montgomery County. So we've grown, now from 4 people in 2015 to over 90 people today. And that really just speaks to the overall growth of life sciences in this region. So we were on a great trajectory. And then COVID hit, and I'm sure you know the stats much better than I do. The amount of funding that came into this region was astronomical. And so in the last few years, we have seen a ton of developments at least get started or get talked about. So a lot of these developers wanted to do what's called spec builds, so building on a speculative basis. Some of those did go through, some of those didn't. Some are still waiting to pull the trigger and make the final decision to move forward with actual design and construction. But it's certainly more activity than we would have seen. So I do work with a lot of these developers. I can't imagine how scary it is to make that kind of investment without a tenant already committed to that space. But some of them did it, and they did it very successfully. And so we fit out quite a few manufacturing spaces, quite a few R&D spaces, and then quite a few that were a combination of all of that.
So basically, the life science industry has been growing for several years, as you've mentioned, but the commercial real estate market is really down because of the pandemic and the change in workforce needs. So and you talk about conversions. Have you seen a number of conversions from commercial office space going into more wet lab or life science space over the last couple of years?
I would say we've seen a little more than we normally would, but I think what you saw was a ton of people exploring that option and then realizing how difficult it can actually be.
And how expensive it is.
Exactly, right? I mean, somebody comes to us and says, can we do this? The answer is always yes. But how much is it going to cost you, right? Does it make financial sense to move forward with something like that? So yes, you certainly can do a lot of those conversions. We did see it done. We saw it done well quite a few times, but it's not the mass conversion that I think everybody thought was going to happen a couple of years ago.
So what do you see as the trend for the future related to your business within our region?
So within this region, I just see continued growth kind of on a balanced basis. So I see continued growth on the R&D side as well as the commercial scale manufacturing side. One of the most exciting things has been, for me, I really didn't know a whole lot about this industry before coming in 3.5 years ago. And I've spent my whole life in the Maryland life sciences, but not on this side. And so learning about HGS and what that meant for this region, for them to really, essentially they were the base that everything here is built off of. And kind of learning the history of what companies came in and decided to plant their flag here. And I just see us continuing to grow off that because we're really still, I would think, in sort of our infancy when it comes to what we expect to be in the next 20 years. And I think one of the great things that we're seeing is universities like Johns Hopkins and University of Maryland really heavily investing in these small startup companies because we need a mix of companies like Kite Pharma coming in from across the country, right? And saying, this is where we've decided to put our new facility. And you got to mix that with the Novavaxes or the REGENXBIOs of the world growing up kind of naturally in the region. And that's what we've seen. And so we've just got to continue down that path.
And then you mentioned you have 22 offices. So I would imagine you're in every one of the large life science markets in the country. When you look at people who come in to evaluate our region versus some other cities or regions in the country, who do you see as our greatest competition?
So I've had this conversation a few times with people where it's extremely frustrating to hear companies talk about where they're going to land on the East Coast. And they say, well, we looked at Boston, we looked at Philly, we looked at North Carolina. And I'm sitting there going, well, what happened to Maryland? Where were we in that conversation? So I think it's really it's a long-term effort to get yourselves in that conversation. And I think all the work that your company and other organizations in the region have done to get us on the map has been huge. And, you can't expect overnight to go from not being on that list to jumping up to number one or number two. But I think we're certainly moving in the right direction there. What I like to describe us as, and this may just be my natural Maryland background coming out, is we're kind of a little version of a lot of these places, right? I think Montgomery County is a miniature version of Boston. We have a very dense population of biotech companies in Montgomery County. I mean, looking outside my office here in Rockville, I can see 20 different companies. And then when you get out to Frederick, I think that's kind of a little version of North Carolina. So land's a little bit cheaper, cost of living's a little bit lower. So you get sort of the best of both worlds. And let's not kid ourselves, they're with no traffic, 20 minutes apart. Even with traffic, 40 minutes apart. That's crazy to have those in such close proximity.
Then you look at the cost associated with Maryland versus the other markets and really the quality of life and all of the other elements that are necessary, the availability of workforce, which you need for if you're going to grow a business or bring in a new operation. And I think we do have all of the assets. I just don't know whether or not we have been as proactive in the marketing of these assets to the extent that we could. So is that one of your jobs, Jake?
Yeah, absolutely. So we try not to get into too much competition between the offices. So we're usually somewhat agnostic when we're talking to a company about what site they want to go to. Ultimately for us, it's just what's the best need for the client? What's the best case scenario for them? But I do interact quite a bit with a lot of our Department of Commerce folks and some of our economic development folks here in Maryland and Northern Virginia. And I have these same conversations that we're having now and try to help them identify Maryland and really present Maryland as a great opportunity for these companies to come in and, again, get the best of all worlds.
Right. And I guess one of your jobs as the Director of Business Development for CRB is to create more visibility for the company as well as the environment and the region you're in. And I think one of the things that you do to create some of that increased visibility is I guess you're the current president of ISPE. Is that correct?
So I'm the current president of the local chapter here for ISPE. Yes.
And tell me what ISPE stands for and how big of a geographical area the chapter covers.
Sure. So ISPE, and this will probably be helpful for a lot of people because 3.5 years ago, I didn't know what ISPE was. So it's the International Society for Pharmaceutical Engineering. And like the name says, it is an international organization. There are chapters all over the world. Some of our larger events have been fortunate enough to meet with leadership from Japan and other countries. It's been an incredible experience. But here for the local chapter, it's the Chesapeake Bay Area chapter. And we really cover what would be considered the BioHealth Capital Region. So all of Maryland, we lump in Northern Virginia to that, really all that whole Chesapeake Bay Area region.
And so when you say international, the meeting you had at the Marriott a couple of weeks ago, was that an international meeting or a local meeting?
That was an international meeting. We've been fortunate enough for the last few years. So we had that, which was the Facilities of the Future conference. And then in a few weeks, we're actually having the Aseptic conference back at that same Marriott. And we've done that for the last 3 years now. Part of that was COVID related. It was easier to keep it at the same place each year. Normally it would bounce around, and it'll continue to bounce around next year to different sites. But yes, for the last 3 years, we've had these large international shows with people from all over the world coming into this region. And so we've been doing our best to be a good ambassador and get the chapter involved and let people know all the great things that we're doing here.
So talk a little bit about the mission of ISPE and what it really does for its members.
So ISPE, it's a nonprofit organization. It really serves its members by trying to lead scientific and technical and regulatory advancement throughout the entire pharmaceutical life cycle. So this does involve people from research and development through clinical manufacturing onto commercial manufacturing, everything to get that drug from its conception all the way to the patients that ultimately we're here to serve. So it's really a lot about regulatory guidance and education, and then, like any great organization, networking. So as the local chapter for Chesapeake Bay, we really try to follow those kind of guidelines that are set up by the international organization. So when I took over back in 2021, honestly, I've got the great honor of following some incredible people that also served in this role, including, I don't know if you know Tony Moreira.
No, I don't.
So he's from UMBC, and he's actually the founding member of this chapter. Just had a great conversation with him down at universities at Shady Grove the other night. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to grow the membership, because as we see the life sciences grow in this area, it's something that it's a goal we've set for ourselves, and we've done it very well over the last year and a half. We've gone from 350 members, which is where we were basically floating between 300, 350 for about a decade. And in the last year and a half, we've grown that to over 600 members now in the region, which has been an amazing growth. I would love to take credit for that, but it would be not only arrogant, but also kind of misleading. What really, the way we've achieved that is, one, I've got a great set of volunteers that I'm able to just kind of get out of the way, let them do what they want to do, give them a thumbs up. And they've put some incredible events together over the last year. And then really the big thing has been the growth that we've already talked about here in this region. You know, some of the great companies that have either grown up here or planted their flag here. And that's just provided us with this enormous potential for new membership. So we try to get those people together as much as we can. I think on the calendar this year, we've got 20 events planned for 2023. That's a mix of, strictly networking events, educational events, women in pharma events. And then we have our MAST showcase, which is the Mid-Atlantic Science and Technology Showcase. That's coming up on April 19th. And that'll be a great opportunity to get the whole membership together and learn about, some of the latest and greatest technologies in the industry.
And your events, are somewhat specialized for the industry that you're in, but there are a number of organizations that have multiple events within the BioHealth Capital Region. How do you balance out your events versus other events that other people put on to make sure there isn't duplicity or confusion as to what people should sponsor?
Absolutely. So I like that because it touches on two things. One is a conversation that I had the other day, which is, are we oversaturating the market? And I was talking to Chris Frew from BioBuzz about this, and it was just a question of, are we reaching a point where there are too many events? And I don't think so, honestly, because we have sold out every event we've had. And I think the last 10 events we've had were all sold out. Now, as you know, we kind of alluded to Want to Go Wednesday, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But because of that, I do keep pretty close tabs on what events are happening in this area, in our industry. And so we do our best to make sure that we're not overlapping on, the same night or anything like that, because ultimately ISPE, is here to serve the whole of the biotech and pharma industry. And we can't do that if we're not playing nice with other organizations. So we're also trying to not only avoid overlap, but also collaborate as much as we can.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we all have to be conscious of, because we're really not in the event business. We have 2 a year, which is the BioForum and our investment conference. And we try to structure them in a way to where they don't compete directly with other people. But yeah, we are sensitive that you need to differentiate the events to where they appeal to the primary audience that you're trying to attract, but at the same time, not try to confuse the region about who's doing what and who's on first, basically.
Yeah, it's going to be really tough to grow if we've got a bunch of infighting with the organizations that are trying to help the region grow.
Yeah, tell me, you mentioned 250 new members, and I'll get off of ISPE in a second, but What is the makeup of these members? How would you describe these 250 new people that were not involved before that are finally getting engaged?
So at its core, it's going to be engineers, just by the nature of what our organization does and kind of the main companies that are kind of our key industry members. So, again, I've mentioned some of the names already, but think company like, AstraZeneca and them. So those are key partners. So a lot of the folks that work there as engineers are going to be our core membership. But on top of that, you've got all the companies that are serving them. So what we would consider sort of the vendor side of ISPE. So a lot of that new membership has also been companies that support those manufacturers of drugs and therapies. So obviously, CRB would fall into that category, but you've got equipment vendors and other consulting companies.
Gotcha. I understand. So it's not just the actual pharmaceutical or biotech companies, it's all of those who support them as well. But we've been talking a little bit about Want to Go Wednesday and your profile in social media. So talk a little bit about Want to Go Wednesday. How'd you come up with the idea? How about the name and what really you're trying to accomplish with it?
Yeah. So the idea behind it was that I wanted to do something. And I didn't know what that something was, but I knew that I always enjoyed getting out to events and networking with people. And I just knew I wanted to really do a little bit of personal branding, just, for my own career. And then secondarily for the company I was working for at the time. So I knew I wanted to do something. And it turns out I found that I am not very creative. So I was trying to figure out, I really don't want to produce new content all the time. And so eventually I came to the realization I'm already looking up all these events to see what's happening so that I could go out there physically and go network with people. So I was talking to my wife about it and I just said, well, why don't I just tell everybody else what I'm finding out? So I figured that's a great way to generate content and not have to come up with my opinion on some topic once a week. So I came up with the idea of doing this weekly video. And then it comes to the name and how do you develop a name? And so my wife and I were actually sitting at Chick-fil-A while the kids were in the play place and we were talking about it and tried through a few different ones. And eventually, I came up with something that wasn't Want to Go Wednesday, but close to it. And she said, how about Want to Go Wednesday? And I said, I kind of like the ring. Let's sleep on it and see what happens. And that's what we did. Next day, it still sounded good. So we went with it.
And how long have you been doing it now, Jake?
It has been 4 years. Yeah, 4.5 years I've been doing it now.
And then talk a little bit about, it's a video, but talk about what you cover in that video.
So the video was meant to basically tell people what events are coming up in this region in our industry. I have expanded it a little bit outside of our region since then, but originally it was just meant to say, hey, in the next few weeks, here's some of the great events that are coming up. Because ultimately, my goal is to provide value to people. There's no sense in me getting on once a week and telling people how great I am or how great my company is. I want to get on and give them something that they can actually use. So the goal is to, just educate people on what events are coming up so that they can get out, meet other people in the industry, and really keep the conversation going about how great the BioHealth Capital Region is.
And other than the video series, and I guess you promote that through many different social media outlets rather than just LinkedIn. Is that true?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
I don't have a great team behind me doing any of that stuff. And I just found that LinkedIn was where I was getting the most traction and seemed to be the right place to be spending my time.
I guess you need my producer, Andy Eckert, to work with you on some other outlets.
We'll see if I can afford him.
Okay. I got it. Do you create a website for Want to Go Wednesday, or is everything just focused really on your video series on LinkedIn?
Yeah, it's all just focused around the video series on LinkedIn, but it has taken on a life of its own. So
whatever works, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So what else do you think? I'm talking with Jake Greenwood, who's the Director of Business Development for CRB. What is there that you would like people to know about CRB or yourself or this region that we haven't covered that you would think would be important for the listeners?
Wow. So I think we've covered a lot of great topics today. In terms of CRB, selfishly, obviously, if there's anybody listening who needs design or construction services, we're always open to that. But one of the other great things that CRB has done is really made an effort to educate the community on what are the latest and greatest technologies, not just from a CRB standpoint, but from a true industry standpoint. And so we do participate in a lot of writing the ISPE and Bioforum guidelines. You'll see, if you happen to be at the Aseptic show, if anybody out there is joining us for that, you'll see some of our subject matter experts speaking, not just on their own, but along with some of our clients on some of the great innovations that we've been able to implement in folks' facilities. And that knowledge doesn't solely come from people at CRB, it comes from our clients, our competitors. But the goal is to truly educate and get the best possible products out there, because ultimately, from both a CRB standpoint, from an ISPE standpoint, and even from a personal standpoint, the goal is ultimately to deliver the best possible drugs and therapies to patients as quickly as possible. And that's what we're all out here to do.
Super. Well, I appreciate the time that we spent together, Jake, getting to know you better. I'm sure we'll see each other at events. You go to every event, so you're omnipresent and you're there everywhere. I'm not at every one that you're at, but I know that you're representing the region well and helping promote the growth of the BioHealth Capital Region. So thank you for what you do with CRB and ISPE and what you're doing personally with Wanna Go Wednesday. And I appreciate Jake Greenwood, Director of Business Development, CRB, being on BioTalk today, and we look forward to follow up with him some in the future on some of the other accomplishments when he grows to 1,000 members of ISPE in the future.
Thank you, Rich. That all means a lot coming from you.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.